Howdy do, folks. This is Hampton, Chappell, and welcome back to the Shed podcast, featuring
Seth Meiselman, Dylan Reid,
and of course, the man himself,
Munday.
Within the next 10 minutes, we'll be discussing the Industrial Revolution in its entirety, including the inventions that put it into action, as well as its effects on the pre-existing social structure, political power, and wealth distribution as a whole. So, first things first, the Industrial Revolution was characterized by the age of invention that set it into motion. Seth, give us some background on that.
Oh yeah, I will. One of the main industries that benefited from this Industrial Revolution was the textile industry. Inventions in this industry included the water frame, the flying shuttle, the cotton gin, and the power loom. Another new industry that advanced was the chemical industry. Early innovations included things like bleach and sulfuric acid. Bleaching powder would be discovered by Charles Tennant, and this spurred the creation of the first great chemical industrial enterprise. His powder would be a cheap and successful product where he would open factories and production would go from just 52 tons in 1799 to almost 10,000 tons just 5 years later.
So Seth, wasn't electricity also a key invention during this time?
Yes. In 1831, scientists discovered an electric current that would become revolutionary. This discovery was a breakthrough and would lead to an electric generator being built in 1832. Over the years, the use of this electricity continued to grow, not only through scientific experiments, but also it was a more advanced way of life. By 1870, the electric motor would be built. Before 1860, steel would be a very expensive product. Then a Bessemer converter would be created, which would mass produce steel a lot cheaper.
But Seth, did you know that before electricity, the main energy source was the steam-powered locomotive?
I did not. Can you explain that a little more, please?
Yeah, the steam-powered locomotive allowed the transportation of goods and people to be moved across large distances in much faster time. This was due to over 2,000 miles of canals built in Britain, which allowed the new steamboats and ships to transport these goods and people, as well as letters, information, and ideas over these large distances. New systems of transportations allowed people to migrate to new areas at cheaper costs with much more ease. Also, the first telegraphy system invented by William Cooke and Charles Wheatstone in 1837 and the telephone invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876 allowed communication to be much more accessible over these large distances.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, here's a map of the railway system at the time that shows these great bounds in transportation.
Okay. Seeing that makes a lot more sense now. So Dylan, what were some of the reactions to industrialization in the society?
Well, because of inequalities in women's rights, such as working wages, women advocated for women's suffrage. An event in support of these rights was the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which discussed rights to make women equal to men in society and allow women to participate in the laws that they could consent to.
Wasn't there also a lack of schooling during factory hours?
Yes, in the factory system, children would be working in factories from dawn till dusk, and there was no time for education. Additionally, women were not originally educated thanks to the cult of domesticity, stating that they were to focus on home and family work. However, the Factory Act, passed in 1833, required at least 2 hours of schooling during factory work hours for the children working. Also, in 1844, the Ragged Schools Union was established to provide education to the children in deep poverty.
So how did the working class react to these industrialization changes?
Because of the poor factory conditions in the working class, riots ensued, some coming from Luddites, who would break machinery in factories as they had a strong distaste for the machinery that was taking their job opportunities. These violent acts were not very successful, with the military taking care of any opposition to the factory system. Also, some labor unions and social clubs were created to fight for injury insurance, better work conditions, and pay, and they were formed by factory workers and families of similar skill sets and interests. So, now that the factory system was in place, how did industrialization become an involving factor in imperialism? The industrializing states needed other colonies that could provide raw materials, and also force their own products into these colonies' markets. As a result, the Berlin Conference took place in 1884 and 1885, splitting African colonies among industrialized European states, and shortly after, Britain colonized India,
with India's exclusion in the Industrial Revolution thus far. The factory system intertwined with the military, producing interchangeable parts that allowed mass production of the exact same weapons that could be repaired easily and made and bought for much cheaper. Among these innovations, a surplus of people from migration to cities provided more people for military forces.
These social transitions, which favored the working class, all led to the rise of a brand new political movement, socialism. This new viewpoint directly contradicted capitalism, as where capitalism emphasized the separation of the government and economic activity, socialism directly encouraged it. Typically, socialism aimed to bring the aristocracy and lower classes together, creating a supposed quote-unquote equality, where capitalism tended to allow business owners free rein over the working class, as long as money and prosperity could result from it.
I understand what you're saying, but we don't really see many hardcore capitalist or socialist countries nowadays. What's to do with that?
Well, most countries tend to operate somewhere in between the two ideas, almost on a spectrum. Where in modern day, countries like the US are seen as symbols of capitalism, where nations such as Vietnam are seen as socialist. Both incorporate elements of each system. Even 18th century Europe had some socialist aspects, albeit very subtle and limited.
To somewhat add on to what Dylan was saying earlier, the societal life during the Industrial Revolution was not too good. To start, the increase of population in cities mixed with the overall poorness of the workers led to overcrowding. Overcrowding was a problem because lots of homes, which the wealthy factory owners built out of cheap materials, didn't have running water nor sanitation, which caused waste and filth to fill the streets and contaminate the rivers. To add on, factories created lots of smog, which covered the cities and polluted the air.
Wasn't the life for workers also undesirable during the time?
Oh yeah, you would have nightmares if you were to see the working conditions and effects of the factory work on people's social life. The worst part about it was the amount of child labor involved inside of the factories.
Child labor?
Yeah, factory owners hired children because they required less pay. They were more obedient than adults, and since they were smaller, they could fit into smaller spaces to fix any jams or problems with the machines. Also, children were used in coal mining to fit into small areas to retrieve coal, but this was very dangerous due to the mines collapsing and inhaling the smoke from the coal, which led to many health problems. To add, many factories weren't properly ventilated and were very hot and cramped. This led to many gruesome injuries which weren't compensated for because there were no laws at the time to protect the well-being of factory workers.
Well, it's about time for a fact. Did you know that the Enclosure Acts cut off open peasant farming? These acts fenced off the open land for the wealthy owners' use only. That reminds me of the time when my neighbors fenced off their backyard because I jumped on their trampoline.
Check out this political cartoon drawn at the time that shows how the managers of factories viciously exploited the working class.
Oh yeah, that pretty much sums it up. Were there any other countries starting to industrialize during this time?
Yes, actually there was. Germany. Before 1860, there were attempts to industrialize Germany, but none really had any success. But by 1870, the modern Germany nation would be created, and thereafter major industries would be founded that would lead to a full-fledged industrialization of Germany.
The reason why Germany had started so late was due to the fact that they were divided into so many small states, and this made it hard for them to communicate before they had the innovations, such as steam-powered trains and steam-powered boats. Also, they did not have as many railroads. Once they did start industrializing, though, they did become pretty big rivals to Great Britain. This was because they would soon become powerhouses in their trades and crafts to all parts of Europe. Their goods had now finally landed on the large market.
Well, we better get back to the factory, as that's all the time our lunch break will allow.
This has been the
SHED
podcast,
Revolutionizing Entertainment.
and we thank you for listening.
No pun invented.